A senior policy advisor for U.S. Congressman Michael Honda. Mr. Shank, I think like most of us, Washington seemed to be taken by surprise by what happened in the early days of this uprising in Egypt, and the message from the White House has changed considerably over the past week. Can you speak to us about the changing U.S. position on Egypt and where it is now?
Yeah, I think Washington is surprised by its waning influence in the Middle East. Certainly the White House and Pentagon are surprised, which is why they're trying to hold any influence they do have still in Cairo. I mean, the influence largely waned because of a double standard in the Middle East. The U.S. supported autocracies at the expense of democracy. So now that the waning influence is much more apparent to the White House and the Pentagon, it's holding on to whatever it can. Now, the Pentagon said yesterday that it's not going to withdraw any of its military aid. Annually, that's $1.3 billion. Since 1970, that's been roughly $65 billion. Joint Chiefs of Staff Chair Admiral Mike Mullen saying that the Egyptian military has been a partner since the 1950s, a good partner of the U.S. Charles Krauthammer in the Washington Post saying today that the Egyptian military should rule the country. So I see Washington, particularly White House, Pentagon, holding on to whatever ally it has in Egypt. That ally is the Egyptian military. That ally is also Suleiman in the VP. He was a former military official, then intelligence chief. So I think Washington's scrambling to have any influence it can yet in Egypt.
That would be official influence, I suppose. But what message does that send when American aid continues to the people of Egypt?
Well, right. So it's a mixed message if we're saying we support freedom and democracy, yet at the same time continuing to prop up autocracies. Now, the protester on the street, be it a secular or religious protester, I think is not going to be happy going from an autocracy to a military regime. So any positioning by Washington or the Pentagon to continue to prop up the Egyptian military or Suleiman is known to be collaborated with the CIA, very responsible for a lot of the torture and rendition. So I think it's problematic to think of any VP Suleiman carrying on. I know Amr Moussa, who runs the Arab League, is thinking about running for presidency. Thankfully, what Suleiman has done well is invited opposition parties to the table. 12 have accepted. They invited the Muslim Brotherhood. So that's good, but it has to be a substantial conversation between opposition parties. All of them invited to the table. 12 have accepted. Going forward, is it going to be Baradei? Is it going to be Suleiman? Is it going to be Moussa? U.S. can't choose because if it picks, it's going to be seen, propping up the next leader of Egypt, which is the history of propping up Mubarak for the last 30 years.
Sir, what's your take on the Muslim Brotherhood? A lot of folks think they're the scariest thing alive, and other people say, hey, there's only 75,000 members in all of Egypt, and there's 20 million people in Cairo alone, and they're just not a major factor. Which side are you in one of those camps?
It's a great question. A lot of analysts coming from the Middle East, Arab Muslim analysts, are saying Muslim Brotherhood is not going to do in Egypt what the Islamic Revolution did in Iran. We're not seeing that. It's 20% of the population in terms of support for political candidates. I don't see it being any kind of extremist wave throughout Egypt, as some analysts in Washington are concerned. And the way to prevent that from happening is to ensure that all opposition parties have a foothold at the very beginning, that the Constitution is rewrit so political parties can run for both the parliament and the presidency. That's how you ensure a moderate way forward.
The United States was not happy when the Palestinians were allowed to vote and they chose Hamas. What's going to happen if Egyptians are allowed to vote and they choose the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, let's look at Indonesia as an example. Some comparisons have been made to Indonesia in the last couple of days. Suharto, 30 years, very similar autocracy, corrupt, repressive. And then in 1998, there was a transition to the VP there. Now, that VP in Indonesia wasn't associated with the military as closely as Suleiman is associated with the Egyptian military. Now, Indonesia has a robust democracy. It has both secular political candidates and religious political candidates. So we have to make sure that that transition happens smoothly. As long as Mubarak helps that transition process along, we can moderate the political process. But, the Shah in Iran stayed in power for 4 months before he relinquished power. That allowed time for the Islamic Revolution to really gain a foothold. If we preempt it early in Egypt, we can, obviate some of that.
Michael Shank speaking to us from Washington today. Always good to speak with you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Dan.